having some fun at the beginning of the Colloquium series today, and that's a special tradition of inducting our new senior research fellows. Yes, I think a round of applause is justified. Absolutely, please. And as a quick reminder, the senior research fellows, these are, senior scholars who have contributed in deep and meaningful ways for a long period of time to the Ostrom workshop, usually former directors, such as Bernie, right? Along with folks who have served in immense important capacities, such as Dan Cole, such as Inza Thiesfeld, our interim Commons program director, and Ina Cooper. So what I'd like to do is just read a little bit about each one. We'll give them their certificates. No NFTs, I'm sorry. We'll take a picture. I asked David to start working on that. And then we'll take it from there. So if it's okay, we'll just do it in alphabetical order really quick. So Dan, everyone knows Dan, has been a workshopper. My gosh, Dan, how long would you even say at this point? Name a decade.
I started presenting in the second half of the 90s.
Absolutely. So for decades, right? Has been in the Bloomington faculty since 2011. Yeah, but before that, of course, IUPUI. Absolutely, absolutely. Has been teaching Y673 for us and help from Inza and Mike this last fall. We'll be teaching Y673 again this fall. Is the author of so many impressive treatises, books, including recently the Rutledge Handbook of the Study of the Commons, and of course the 4 volumes of the Bloomington School, co-edited with Mike. So among 100 others, so 1,000 others. So Dan, I can't think of anyone more deserving. The Workshop Advisory Council all agreed to that, and we'll get a picture in just a minute. But thank you for everything you've done for the workshop for so many years. Continue to do. And then if you want to say a note about Ina as well, Angie, please feel free. But Ina Cooper, guys, is a research scientist here at IU. And is she coming in a minute? We'll turn to her last just in case we can. Yeah, we'll bypass the alphabetical order here. Inza. Inza Thiesfeld, professor of agricultural, environmental economics and food policy at Martin Luther, but most importantly, most recently has been our Commons program director, as well as president of the International Association for the Study of the Commons, and has done so much over this last year to rebuild those bridges between IASC and the workshop that Lynn, of course, was instrumental in co-founding. So we're incredibly thankful, Inza, for everything you've done for the workshop over this last, well, again, like Dan, for many years, but especially this last year.
She's much younger.
Oh, yeah. A lot of runway left here. That's right. And no, just honestly, just thank you for everything. You've been such a guiding light and driving force in the workshop this last year. Needless to say, you're always welcome back. And I'm glad you could be back in person today for this particular event. Sometimes the timing works out well. And the Commons program lecture last week was just lovely. So thank you, Inza, for everything you've done this last year. And your wonderful family who we love hosting. Hopefully we can lure them back again soon too. And Ina, welcome. We were just starting to introduce you just a moment ago, so that the timing's perfect. Ina Cooper, research scientist at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering, as well as the Center for Survey Research. 2 PhDs in information sciences from IU, as well as a PhD in sociology from the Institute of Sociology at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Has been involved with the workshop and with workshoppers, including with Julie for more, was that a decade ago now? My long time, and working very deeply with Angie and others here on a variety of projects, including the new Midwest Data Hub, which is so exciting. So I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, Angie, given your guys' deep relationship as well, but
just thank you for all the support and looking forward to everything we do together from here on out.
Well, that's spot on. That's spot on. And Ina, thank you for all of your contributions in so many ways to the workshop, and welcome as well as a senior research fellow. So if you guys wouldn't mind, maybe we can get all 3 new fellows. Let's get front and center. We do have certificates for you, as I said. I just have to find them. Look at this. Look at this. Hey, we're not messing around. We are not messing around at all. And let me see. I'm wondering.
Can I take some?
Actually, would you? I was going to bother David, but would you mind? Yeah, Anita, I think that'd be great. Let's do that. Let me make sure I get them in the right. Ina, okay, great, lovely, lovely. Fantastic. I guess we could do, should we do individual ones too, and then we can do a group one? Sure, Ina, come on up. I think that would be great.
Handshake like a graduate.
Should we do it? That's better. That's better. Yeah, that looks more impressive. I'm sorry, Dean. We might just stand right here because of the wall of Lynn's honors here. Okay, should we do that? Lovely.
Wall of Fame.
The wall of fame. Okay. Hey. All right. Congratulations.
Yeah, perfect.
Lovely. Okay. Congratulations. Congratulations. Okay. And then we have Inza. Inza, please. Actually, we should have this open. I should have done that for you as well. Sorry about that. There we are. There we are. Lovely. Lovely. Congratulations, Inza. I love that necklace. And then, of course, Dan. I hope this is Dan. Yes, well done.
That's good.
Congratulations, sir.
Thanks, Scott.
Yep.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Oh, and thank you for all. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again to all of our senior research fellows. That's outstanding. And I'm sorry to take a little bit of time away from our distinguished Colloquium speaker, but it's been such a fantastic series this year. So thanks again to all the program directors, the whole committee for
We're on
organizing.
to 5 minutes. We don't
Yeah, I mean, come on, that's relatively efficient, right? Okay, well done. So thank you guys. And without further ado, over to Dean to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Scott. Let's get started. We have Giorgio Zanarone today, visiting associate professor from WashU and soon be joining University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He's been in the US for 3 years and we finally got him over here with at the last minute before he leaves. And so he's ready to talk about us and he knows we'll give him 20 minutes and then I'll keep the cue and the regular way. Thanks, Giorgio.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have a BA in political science. I am interested in institutions and organizations. So I have a deep admiration for Elinor Ostron's work, and I'm very honored to speak to an audience in a workshop that bears her name. So thank you very much for having me. I chose to present to this audience the closest paper to political science that I have. Let's see how it goes. And we are very excited about this project, joined with Miguel Espinosa from Bocconi and Eki Lango from Pompeu Fabra University. It is very much work in progress. It's one of the very first time we present it, so all your comments are especially welcome at this stage of the project. Let me introduce briefly with a few pictures what this paper is about, and then I'll show you the model, the data, and we will discuss. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me anytime with your comments. See. Okay, so starting point of the paper, politicians and interest groups maintain relationships. You may like that or not like that, but it is a fact. And sometimes those relationships may become inconvenient, especially for the politician, because sometimes the client with whom the politician, the interest group with whom the politician is maintaining a relationship, suddenly sees his or her reputation in the politician's country sharply deteriorate. And at that point, the politician is likely to be blamed by various stakeholders for associating with that bad interest group. And so the question we are after in this paper is, how do the two parties in this relationship, the politicians and the interest group, respond to these kinds of reputational shocks? And particularly, we would like to know, how do they respond publicly, which we already know a little bit about, as I will discuss, and how do they respond privately? And does the public response and the public response and the private response coincide? Are they consistent with each other, or do they diverge? So I just want to say that this is a new question to the best of our knowledge, in the sense that we do know something about the public face of the response of politicians to these reputational shocks. We actually know that politicians reduce their public engagement in various ways with these reputable interest groups. We don't know much about the private side of it, and so we don't have a full analysis of how the politician interest group relationship really adapts to these reputational threats. And having the full picture is very important for all the parties who are involved in this game, First of all, for the interest groups that seek access to politics, they would like to know what reactions they should expect from politicians. Does a reputational threat cause the end of these collaborative relationships? Can the relationship survive? What strategies should they enact to navigate the shocks? Here you can see the business school side of me talking about non-market strategies, but also answering this question, having a full picture of this problem is very important for all those stakeholders, voters, activists, media, who seek to actually limit the access of interest groups to politics, because they would like to know how they should really interpret the politicians' visible and public reaction to shocks. And also, if that's not the full picture, what additional behaviors of the politicians they should maybe pay more attention to and monitor. Okay. Lastly, this is not a very easy question to tackle empirically, because we need to observe simultaneously both the public side of the response of politicians and interest groups to reputational shocks and the private side. For the public side, you'll see in a moment that we assemble a new database of congressional speeches of politicians, and we do text data analysis to see how favorable or unfavorable those speeches are to the interest groups that are shocked, and that will be our public response side. The hardest part empirically is to measure the private collaboration, because we cannot, of course, almost never observe directly politicians privately supporting interest groups. We can't see if a senator is talking his or her committee colleagues into approving or rejecting a bill that matter to a certain interest groups to whom the politician is associated. And so in this paper, as you will see, we make some progress on this, because even though we cannot measure directly the actions of support that politicians privately implement, we can observe the lobbying meetings between politicians and interest groups using a novel long series of the Foreign Agents Registration Act data. And as you will see, we will develop a model that shows how we can see these meetings as a sort of price that interest groups pay for the private support of politicians. And I will show you evidence that is consistent with a certain interpretation of the public and private reaction. So even though we can't observe directly the private reaction, we will show data that are consistent with and uniquely consistent with the private reaction taking a certain form. And so just to give you a preview of what we find before I get into the details, we look at the speeches of US politicians and their lobbying meetings with foreign countries around a bunch of external exogenous events that deteriorate the reputation of those foreign countries in the US. And what we find is that for the politicians who have a strong prior association and connection to that shocked foreign country, on the one hand, speeches, public speeches are more negative. We see a withdrawal of public support. That's interesting, not super surprising. And we see more frequent meetings between the politicians and the lobbyists representing those disreputable foreign countries, which we take as continuation of private support, if you want, substitution of private for public support at a higher price. Right? So that's basically what we will find. So the plan for the rest of the talk is I'll show you the model that generate the predictions, especially on private collaboration that we will then test in the data. Then I'll discuss the data and the databases that we use, which is one of the major contributions of the paper. Then I'll talk about the empirical results and we can have some discussion. Model. So this is a super deliberately simple, stark economic model of the relationship between a foreign country and a politician that tries to capture the main forces here. Imagine that there's a foreign country that we call F, and this foreign country F seeks the support of a politician, P, and we measure the prior connection, the strength of the connection between these two parties by some parameter called theta, which is a real number, a real positive number. The politician benefits from supporting the client, the foreign country, meaning they have kind of congruent political preferences. Actually, as you will see, we assume for simplicity they have identical preferences. That doesn't have to be the case, but to some degree they agree on which bill should be approved or which bill should be rejected. And the key idea is that it is costly for the politician to produce political support in favor of this foreign country. The politician has limited time and resources. It is costly for her to actually develop strong arguments to convince other politicians to side with the interests of this foreign client. And the client can reduce the politician's cost of providing this political support through lobbying, by providing information, advice, by investigating, and by communicating the results of this investigation to the politician. And I didn't, of course, invent this. There is a beautiful paper by Hall and Deerdorf and some other follow-up studies that basically advocate a view of lobbying as a legislative subsidy that clients provide to politicians. And you will see that this view of lobbying as a sort of incentive that clients give to politicians to elicit their support generates the kinds of predictions that other models would not easily generate that we will test in the data. And the last ingredient of the model that I want you to keep in mind is that if the politician has a bad reputation, if the foreign client has a bad reputation, there's some stakeholder out there, a voter, an activist, who may punish the politician for supporting this reputable interest group. And we assume that the punishment is exactly equal to that strength of connection theta. And here the idea is that the more the foreign client is associated to the politician, the more outraged the stakeholders are for the collaboration, and the more they will want to punish that politician for sleeping with the enemy. So in this model, we allow for three forms in which the politician could help the foreign client. There could be just purely public support, favorable public speeches. This gives a low benefit to the politician and gives certainty of punishment in case the reputation of the foreign client is bad, because now everybody sees that the politician is supporting this interest group. There could be purely private support. In that case, as I mentioned before, the politician would, in the backstage, talk to other politicians and softly persuade them to support the interests of this client. Here, the benefit is lower. Here the benefit is also low because the support is partial. We assume it's the same as purely public. It doesn't have to be the case. But the punishment is not certain anymore. It is uncertain because now the support is private, so it will become visible with some probability, tau, but it may remain invisible with probability 1 minus tau. So there's lower expected punishment for the politician here. And then, of course, we could have full support, both public and private. That's what generates the maximum benefit. You could think of that as the maximum probability that the bill will be approved or rejected according to the desires of the politician and the client. But there will also be maximal punishment here because the stakeholders will observe with certainty one instance of public support and with some probability also an instance of private support. Okay. Very, very simple setup. And of course, you can see from how I set this up that there's no reason why the politician would ever want to go for the purely public support. It provides the same benefit as the purely private one, as a higher punishment cost. So from now on, the two choices that the politician can make that we want to focus on are private versus full. Okay. And when I will talk sometimes of withdrawal of public support, what I mean is switching from full to purely private. And so what we are trying to do with this very simple model is basically to pin down how, when a shock happens that turns the reputation of the foreign client from good to bad, how does that affect simultaneously the choice of lobbying effort of the foreign client and the choice of type and amount of political support of the politician. And that will give us predictions that we can test in the data that allow us to classify the response of the politician-client relationship to the reputational shock in certain ways. And so I'll illustrate the results of this very simple model with a figure. On the horizontal axis, you have the lobbying effort of the foreign client, how much effort the client spends into preparing for those meetings. On the vertical axis, you have the benefits that the politician gets from supporting the client. And this blue curve is actually the production cost of the politician, how costly it is for the politician to support the client. And so imagine that there's no lobbying effort from the client, then the cost of the politician of supporting the client is this C upper bar, high cost. As the client increases lobbying effort, this cost of providing support decreases. The client is basically lending its investigation and staff capability to reduce the cost of the politician, and it can go down all the way to zero if the client exerts maximum effort. Okay, so imagine now that there's no reputational shock. This foreign client has a good reputation in the US. Of course, in that case, regardless the type of lobbying effort that is exerted by the client, if the politician chooses to provide support, it's going to be full support. There's no risk of punishment here, no reputational issues. So if I support this client, I will go all the way and grab the maximum benefit. However, if there is no lobbying effort, the production cost of the politician is too high relative to the benefits. So to induce the politician to provide some support, this full support, the client will need to lobby a little bit. How much? Well, lobbying is costly, so the client will want to lobby up to the point where the politician is barely willing to support. And so we are going to have this LG lobbying effort, which stands for a good reputation. Now imagine that a shock happens, and now the reputation of the foreign country in the US becomes bad. And suppose that the prior connection between the politician and the client is not too strong. Right? So in this kind of setting, once the lobbying effort is sunk, if the politician decides to support the client, she will go for full support because the connection is not too strong, so the punishment is not going to be too large. So if I support this client, again, I will go all the way. But of course, now there is, with some probability, a punishment because the reputation of the client is bad. So if I stick to the initial lobbying effort, the politician will not be willing to provide support. I have to increase effort a little bit, again, until the incentive to support is restored. So if a shock happens, we're going to see an increase in lobbying effort. Now imagine that the connection between the politician and the foreign country is very strong. We are going to have an even greater deterioration in the benefit, in the expected benefit of the politician because of the much higher punishment, likelihood of punishment. And this time, if the politician decides to support, she will go for purely private support because full support is way too costly. And the lobbying effort that is necessary to induce this private support of the politician is going to be even larger than the one we had under low connections.
Giorgio, do you realize you're 15 minutes in already?
Mm-hmm. Oh, so I thought I had 1 hour.
Oh, you have 20 minutes to present.
Oh, okay.
I told you that several times.
All right, that's okay. I can go fast.
No.
That's fine. Let me, so
Then we kick a
it
cue.
was still the evidence is very clear. So the most important thing was to make the mechanism clear. So predictions we get from this, suppose the foreign client's reputation turns bad, then when there is high connection, the politician maintains private political support, but withdraws public support. The foreign client will spend more lobbying effort to elicit the politician's support. So we should see more meetings. And the more connected the politician is to the foreign client, the larger this increase in lobbying effort. And this is what we test in the data. Okay, so let me just point out, let me skip a lot of the fancy stuff.
In your answers to questions, you can certainly go into things. So keep
Sure.
that in mind. So I'm sorry about that. I thought we.
That's okay. So let me point out just that how we measure lobbying effort is, as I said before, grabbing all the registries in the Pharah files for 20 years and basically count all the contacts and particularly in-person meetings between the lobbyists and the foreign clients. That's the only kind of database that allows to extract that kind of information. And so let me go straight to, I I already talked about data analysis. So one thing about the data I want to say is that I have been talking all the time about reputational shock. So we, with the help of RAs, we developed a list of events that tarnished the reputation of some foreign country in the US, which received a lot of media attention and were believed to be kind of sudden and consequential, although not all of them are equally consequential, as you can see. And the empirical results are divided in three parts. The first set of results shows that indeed there is a reputational spillover here. When there is a shock, the politician who is associated to the shocked foreign country gets punished. How do we measure that? We look at campaign contributions. And here, what you can see, it's a diff and diff analysis. And for each shocked country and politician, we look at the sentiment in the public speeches of the politician about that country 4 semesters before and 4 semesters after the shock. Pay attention to the interaction coefficient in this regression. What we see is that when there is a reputational shock, the public speeches of the politician towards that shock country become less favorable. Okay? So this is the evidence of withdrawal of public support. Sorry, this is because I'm going too fast. This is not about the speeches. This is the contribution. So what this says is that when the country gets shocked, the politician who is associated more strongly to that country receives fewer campaign contributions, both by organizations, this is the PAC data, and by individual contributors. Okay? So there is a punishment there. Now, what I was talking about before, let me skip this robustness, evidence on public support. Here, what we see, as I said before, is that the connected politicians publicly distance themselves from the shock countries by speaking worsely, less favorably about those countries after the shock. Again, the interaction is negative, and the dependent variable here is favorable sentiment in the public speeches. And the last piece of evidence is the one about lobbying effort. And here what we show is that after the shock, politicians who are more strongly associated to the shock country, they actually maintain more frequent contacts with the lobbyists of those countries. And they also have, if we narrow down to in-person meetings, more frequent in-person meetings. So this is not just emails or quick phone calls. There's actually an increase in the investment and time that is devoted by both the client and the politician to talk to each other. And so what do we take out of this? What we take out of this is that there are reputational spillovers in politics. There's this dark side of political relationships. If you associate with the wrong client, if something goes wrong with that client, even though you have done nothing particularly bad, you could be punished. The most interesting thing is there is this decoupling of public and private support. We see evidence of withdrawal of public support. That's not that surprising, but we see a continuation of private support or evidence consistent with a continuation of private support at a higher price. And lastly, there's evidence, not very frequent evidence, in favor of this view of lobbying as a subsidy incentive that interest groups provide to politicians, which is pretty. And I will close it here. Just to let you
So I'll keep.
I just love McCain. It was a fun.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the confusion there. So I'll keep the queue. I've got Gustavo and I'll just Dan. And
Yes.
we'll keep marching through until I'll put myself on. Oh, go ahead, Gustavo.
Okay, very interesting stuff, Giorgio. I really love it. I was thinking about potential alternative mechanism. It's when there is a problem with the country, you have more incentives to have meetings with that country, regardless. But then the president or whatever Secretary of State doesn't want to engage publicly in a meeting, so they use these guys as backup channels. That's why they are having more meetings with this.
But why per se would you want to have more meetings when something bad happens?
Well, there are more issues to solve, with this country, It's like something happened and now I may be considering bombing you or not before I was not. So there are more things on the table, no?
This argument, however, would not lead you to predict that you should see a sharper effect depending on the degree of connection between the politician and the country, right? Once you control for the politician and the political preferences, we have a lot of fixed effects there that I didn't have time to discuss. Party semester fixed effect and politician fixed effects. I guess the stock of issues that we need to talk about would be fixed, determined by the external environment. And so connection should not drive or shape the extent of this increase in meetings. So I think more about what you said, but I see your point. But yeah, that's my immediate reaction to that.
It might be a point that people from international relations would immediately say. So maybe it's like, I know, you want to address it in advance. Exactly.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Giorgio, I'm really sorry. Would you mind just stopping the screen sharing?
Yes.
A request to do that. Sorry about that. Yeah, no. Like Dean said, we can refer back for sure.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead. Yeah.
So the lobbying relationship is an interesting one to me, and you seem to be simplifying it to a substantial extent, right? So it's not only, say, a foreign country that lobbies with a US politician. The US politician may be lobbying a foreign country at the same time for certain things that politician or a group of politicians or a party or the entire US government might want from that country. Right? And so that could explain why after, going back to Gustavo's point, why after a crisis emerges with that other country, why there might be more frequent contacts.
So your story is that the politician becomes more important for the politician to lobby the foreign country to this foreign country after this reputational shock.
It could be, and not just in the politician's own self-interest necessarily either. It could be the party interest.
Okay. You have to think a little bit about this. How would I think of this in terms of the incentives of the parties to talk to each other? Because I would, again, I have to think about it. I don't see a priori why the politician who is particularly connected to that foreign country and therefore faces a higher risk of reputational threat would want to engage more in this kind of lobbying from the other side that you are describing, which of course I agree exists. Because in a sense, I would be tempted to say that the politician should be, that kind of politician should be more worried about, once the shock happens, increase the contacts with the foreign client, which may or may not remain private. So once again, I have to think about it, but I'm not 100% sure that I would expect to see this, the degree of connectedness between the politician and the foreign country driving this increase in the need to talk to each other. But certainly I need to think more about this aspect. I totally agree with both comments. As I said, this is very much work in progress. Yes.
So following.
Yes, hold. I have myself on the list first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I have we'll go ahead. I'll come in after. That's fine.
I think Jamie raised her hand too.
Jamie, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
sorry. Okay, so on this point, private that may become public, that seems a little problematic for the model, because you very clearly suggested that they have very different costs. And I was curious about how private is, given that you were able to access this data. And I'm also thinking of, and this is a different kind of connection, but I'm also just thinking of actually, for instance, Macron's recent discussion of Le Pen's connections to Putin and how that mattered so much for her reputation. It's not clear that that was that important in the election, right? But so how private is private, and how are you going to help us believe you that you can stylize it in this way? which is, I think I could be convinced, but I just want to. And more broadly to the Le Pen discussion, one thing that would be helpful, I think, you have a lot in this paper already, so. But even just starting, I don't think you did, and I apologize if I missed it, but like even like a superficial case that lets us see like how this plays out, what you mean by historical or past connections, and what like the sort of stock of issues that is unlikely to have changed except for this shock, and therefore you avoid Gustavo's, objection, but just sort of, and that would help us then understand both the scope conditions and also what these things look like in real life. And then my last final point is that there's a team here at IU working on a database of global business politician connections. It might be just an interesting conversation to have with them. It's Sarah Barley-Dansman and Will Weinkoff. They have an NSF to gather this data. And so I know it's still early stages for them, but it sounds like you guys could have an interesting conversation.
Wonderful. So the third one, fantastic. I will definitely try to have that conversation. Let me answer your two questions, okay? So first of all, how private is private? Here there's a subtlety, right? So when I talk about private collaboration, private support in the model, as you might remember, I mean the actual acts of support that the politician provides, which we cannot observe in the data. What we observe is the lobbying effort, right? And you have a point in saying, well, there are these Pharah registry files, which means that by definition, if we could access it, someone else could also access the information on those lobbying meetings. So there's two things here. And so I guess where you are going is that maybe the stakeholders, the voters, the activists, they could look at those meetings and infer from seeing a lot of those meetings that there is some hidden private collaboration going on, right? So there are two answers to that. The first answer is that it's not based on the conversations that I had with people who work actually on lobbying with foreign clients. Yes, the Pharah registries are public data. They are not easy to read. They are quite messy. We had to work for a year with arrays to clean that up and make them readable. So I would say there is a significant cost of actually making those data public, which might make them partially private in the sense of
But now you have incurred it, and so now.
Right. So from now on,
I'm just kidding.
from now on, nobody can do this anymore.
Exactly.
The other thing is that those are the Pharah registries don't provide information on the content of the meetings, of course, which means that my sense of this is that if I am a journalist or an activist and I want to make a strong case against a politician of sleeping with the enemy, I could certainly mention, if I went through the trouble of getting the Pharah data on the meetings, that this politician has been meeting a lot with the lobbyist who works with this client. But to convince the public that this politician is being really bad and maximize the punishment, I should probably know something about what has really been discussed. And so when there's a public speech in which the politician is caught expressing public support for the country, that's smoking gun evidence. If the only evidence I provide is there have been a bunch of meetings, well, it could be that the politician didn't want to be rude, but said no to everything that the client has. So I would capture that in the model as a known one, less than one probability that even if the meeting themselves are observed, they will result in punishment because the actual support is not observed, right? So if the meetings become public information, for the punishment to occur, there's an extra step. The stakeholder has to be able to convince the public or whoever is punishing that this politician is really doing something bad, is supporting a country that has done something horrible. And the observation of the meetings per se, they don't give you that information because the content remains private. So that's the way in which I think using those data is consistent with the partially private collaboration that I describe in the model. And then I agree with you that I should present an example just to justify myself a little bit. This is also part of having gone so fast in the presentation of the data because I didn't even say how exactly we measure the connection, the strength of the connection. So let me remedy. The way we measure connection is an indicator variable, a dummy variable that takes value 1. If you are the politician that I, foreign client, have been lobbying the most among all other politicians in the past, right? So I am China, you are a US politician, you are my man in the US, you are the politician I've been lobbying the most. And when that happens, we say that there is a strong connection between the politician and the foreign country. When that doesn't happen, we have a weaker connection. And so the way we measure connection is through the Pharah Data past contacts that are very particularly intense.
Okay, let me get the list and I'll no. So Tina, Gustavo, Jamie before that, then I'm going to take my crack here now. So there's a lot of things here. I'll just want to throw a few things at you about the data. So I'm basically skeptical of what you're measuring important things. And so I'm looking at your table of shocks, and you've got the well-known Spanish leader who respects the US flag. I've never heard of this before. And we've got 9/11 in there, and we've got 3 or 4 things from China and Iran. There's a lot of things that China's doing. And I don't know how your methodology to claim you're identifying an important shock here. That's not potentially perfectly correlated with all sorts of other stuff that's going on. So that's, one thing you might do is show us data where you just look at, 9/11, let's say, or isolate your regressions to compare these shocks. That's one thing. I don't know what your sample size is. Do you have politicians who have bad relationships with countries? So McCain's shaking hands with the king. There are other politicians who've been trashing Saudi Arabia. How do they, your model should have them in there, and the data should potentially be able to, identify that sort of thing. So those are some things right off the bat that just kind of jumped out at me, and I'll let you take a crack at those.
So very good point, Dean. First of all, we have done some robustness checks that I didn't have time to show. Actually, I didn't even put them in the slide because of the lack of time. So if you isolate 9/11, you only look at 9/11, the effects we observe are still there. If you take away 9/11, interestingly, the effects are also still there. There are country fixed effects, of course, in the regressions. So that's my B clarification. And my C clarification is we are actually, so how did we get that list of shocks? We collected, there's not an obvious way in which you obtain that list. So we got a bunch of arrays and we asked them to dig for events that were covered by the media substantially and that they appeared to reduce the reputation of a certain country in the US. And if all the arrays agreed that event X was important, it would be in the list. So we are now thinking about how we could replicate the study, constructing a list in a more objective manner. There are some databases that measure the sentiment of US public, for example, towards various foreign countries. They're a bit partial as far as I understand, but we are working on assembling another list of shocks that is based on that criterion. Moments in which a country's reputation, according to those polls, has sunk, and see if we can call events that cause that sinking in the reputation our shock events, and if the results continue to go through. That's something we are planning to do. Because I think part of your skepticism is there are so many events there, it's not clear to me if they are all really important, if they all really affected the US public and the opinion about a certain country. And part of that could be the way the list has been constructed. There is a bit of subjectivity in how those events have been called important shocks. So we are interested in replicating the results with a different. But with this data, we have done some robustness, and it seems that the results are not sensitive to excluding certain shocks or restricting attention to certain shocks. And I guess 9/11 in that whole list is probably the one that everybody would agree had a very, very strong impact on the US public opinions. And the Zapatero episode, you could argue, had a more modest impact.
Okay, Jamie is next.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious, how accurate is the data from Pharah? Meaning, yes, politicians are required to register their contact with foreign businesses, but what's the percentage rate with which they actually do? Like, how many times do they not and get away with it? And I know, like, that's asking a question that couldn't actually be measured, but is there a sense that this is not, that not that we don't have 100% accounting of all the companies that interact with politicians?
Yeah, so I think I definitely believe that there is some non-compliance with Pharah, like with almost every law. The punishment is quite strict, up to 5 years of imprisonment. So the lobbyists I have talked to told me that they take the Pharah obligation seriously. But I also know some papers that have discussed that there could be non-compliance. So to us, the most important thing is that the extent of non-compliance is not systematically correlated with the shocks that we are basically observing, right? So if there is some non-compliance that doesn't give us a 100% accurate measure of the number of meetings, for example, it doesn't really bias our results so long as the events that we call shocks don't systematically cause non-compliance to go up or down in a certain way. And we don't have good reasons to believe that that would be the case. And I would say that you could argue that maybe, we don't think that's the case, but you could argue that maybe when there is a reputational shock that involves a foreign country, maybe there is more willingness to comply with the Pharah data because there is some fear of more attention placed on that case and relationships with that country. But then again, I wouldn't make sense of why we see the politicians who are more strongly related and compromised with that country would increase the reporting of the meetings, because everybody who has written about Pharah points out that those who are most interested potentially in under-reporting or not complying with the law are precisely the countries that have something to hide, basically, who might be in the spotlight if they report accurately. So there's two things here. A, I don't think these are actually shocks to enforcement of Pharah. There's no evidence I know of that these events have caused an increase in the enforcement of Pharah. B, even if that was the case, I would expect results to go kind of in the opposite direction. But it's a totally valid point. Yeah, we have thought about it.
Yeah, Tina.
Yeah, for a question of follow-up and how you or your research, I was thinking, is there also a way to use your research model, so to speak, to study the lobbying influence of corporate parties, of corporate activity? And also, can you apply this to a unit as the European Union, which is of course very, very vulnerable for lobbying, and there's a lot of lobbying going on, but in particular by corporate parties, I think. How does that work, and have you studied any of that?
So first of all, the Pharah data contains information about lobbying, not only from countries, but also from any organizations, any entities that are located abroad. So in that sense, if I understood your first question correctly, we could actually look into private firms, private organizations, and how they lobby, and see if that differs in some systematic way from how around these shocks the governments, the countries themselves lobby. So we could do that. I wouldn't expect the results to be very different if the logic of the model we developed and the narrative are correct, because basically the incentive to lobby more would be kind of the same. These private organizations would want to maintain influence in US politics. and they would need to pay a bit of a higher price to induce the politicians to give them support, and the politicians would be scared if they have been in the past associated to that private firm who is located abroad, if now associating with firms in that country is a potential source of trouble. But maybe there is a bit less of blame for a private firm compared to the whole country. So I think it would be interesting to investigate that, and we can definitely do that. So that's a very good point. On Europe, I actually don't know. I haven't investigated this, and so I am not aware whether there is an equivalent of the Pharah registries in Europe. And maybe you know more about that than me. I have the sensation that lobbying in Europe is regulated very differently, and there's no European-wide regulation of lobbying. But it's.
I think there is actually. I don't know anything about this topic, but I think
there
is an obligation for, and that's the other small point I was wondering about, for especially intermediary lobbying organizations. So you don't really mention them. It seems to be one-to-one
Yes.
for lobbying efforts, but of course there's intermediaries that take this role, that have a lot of experience in this. Actually, one of my former PhD students is now working for a lobbying organization, so I learned a lot through him. But I think there is an obligation also in the European Union to register as a lobbying organization, and I'm not sure how far it goes and to what extent and what detail, but I think there should be some data there.
We definitely look into that. So not for this paper maybe, but for a follow-up paper.
You probably have more variables as well, and more difference, more variety that could also be very
Because of
interesting
different countries, yeah.
to incorporate in your model.
Yeah, I've got 5 people in the queue, so we're going to, we just,
Lightning round.
yeah, well, maybe not like, we've got Brian, Jörg, hopefully I pronounced that correct, Gustavo, Dan, and Angie. So, Brian, go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Jörg was actually in front of me, but I'll try and be quite quick, and I did post in the chat.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. What happens if the norms shift? If people become more cynical, or you have prominent examples to motivate Lindsey Graham, who once tried to be statesmanlike and now seems not concerned about his reputation and such. And related to that, are there indications that politicians vary, either different types of politicians or factors on which politicians vary in their responses? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Again, my bad for getting confused about the structure of the seminar. So I went so fast on the presentation of the data, but in all the regressions that I presented, we have politician fixed effects. So we are holding constant the person, John McCain or whoever politician who is at the center of this relationship, right? And within that particular politician, thanks to those politician fixed effect, we are looking at whether, depending on the country is associated with whom that goes through a shock, whether we see this decrease in public support and increase in lobbying meetings. So we should be holding constant all those personal features of the politician that you were mentioning that could, of course, affect. Maybe I misunderstood your question.
Keep it very quick, but Lindsey Graham is a politician who seems to have changed his behavior, but we should move on to other people. Thank you.
Okay, that's.
Okay, Jörg, go ahead, please.
Yes, so my question, I think, links to a couple of previous questions. I was wondering if for the politician, there aren't 2 possible equilibria. Depending on, for them, this relationship is also an investment. And the question is how toxic that relationship has become. If you, for example, think about current relationships with Russia, specifically with Putin, only one European government leader so far has dared to visit Putin. So the Austrians apparently still think that it's something that you can do, whereas no German government representative would dare having any contact with Putin or any representative of the Russian government. So I think there might be 2 possible equilibria. If you think that this will be a continued exchange relationship, you might actually conduct damage mitigation and therefore have more meetings. Whereas if you think that this is done, this is over, there's no cooperation in the future, then you burn the bridges and you don't cooperate at all anymore. And I think that might lead to some heterogeneity then also among the politicians, but not because of their characteristics, but because of how they see the relationship.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So the model I presented is a one-shot model that is not really allowing for some sort of sustained long-term collaboration sustained by the shadow of the future. I guess the results that we observe are not consistent, at least on average, with many of these politicians feeling like the relationship is over and therefore they should, as you said, completely cut the relationship with that foreign country. But it would be nice, and we were actually thinking about that, to come up with a good measure, which is tricky, but I think we can think about it, of how likely the relationship is to continue in the future, how valuable is it, how long is the horizon of these two parties working together, and see if that's a good moderating factor. So I think it's a valid, from a theoretical point of view, I agree with your statement. We have to think about empirically how we could implement that. But I would expect something like what you described. Yeah.
We're almost out of time, so let's just have our last three people ask their questions, and Giorgio wait and see how much time is left to address some or none of them or all or what have you. So we have Gustavo, Dan, and Angie.
Just very fast. So two questions. One is electoral effects. So you are close to elections, a shock or not. That's probably important. And second one, it's kind of thinking a little bit more about selection. So I remember this paper from the late 90s, like when it takes a Nixon to go to China. So only some type of politicians are willing to engage in these risky things. Okay. Well, then explore a little bit more heterogeneity. It's like you are last term, you are about to retire, you have a whole career, a safe career, a not so safe career. That may change your incentives there. And I understand that they do not affect your estimations because you have fixed effects. Well, not quite sure, because within this politicians, you can be in the last term or not. So for some of things,
we can measure that. So we can definitely do that. Yeah, we have the data for that.
Okay, really quickly, building on Jörg's comment, if I'm a foreign country and I'm about to do something bad, like kill Khashoggi, if I'm Saudi Arabia, I'm going to be increasing my contacts before the fact, and maybe even funneling money, right? The illicit side that's hard to measure, to maintain support, right? So right after they killed Khashoggi, while they're thinking about passing this bill on limiting arms, Senator Inhofe makes a speech on the floor. I'm not giving up our great ally because of this one thing. That's public.
That's why.
Okay, so
Angie has the last,
yes.
last question, and you have 1 minute.
I'll hang out. I want to know how you've accounted for times when the politicians know more than others. 9/11 is the perfect example. Who was behind the attack shifted? Would those who knew the murkiness of the attribution of the attack behave differently?
I'm sorry, can you say it again a bit?
Yeah, I wrote an email because I wasn't sure I was going to get to ask. How have you accounted for the times when the politicians know more than others? 9/11 is the perfect example. Who was behind the attack shifted? Wouldn't those who knew the murkiness of the attribution of the attack behave differently in these contexts?
Yeah, so I guess what I can say about this is what I kind of answered to Dean before, which is that the results are not sensitive to the inclusion of 9/11, which is a very special shock in a way. They continue to hold even if we take 9/11 out of the list of shocks, which yes is the shock in that list.
Situations where politicians know a whole hell of a lot more than we do.
Yeah.
And only certain politicians know a whole hell of a lot more than I do.
Mm-hmm.
Which maybe we should be unhappy about, but to me, it's not something that you can just easily eliminate and pretend like all politicians have the same standard of knowledge in a given environment, regardless of it.
Yeah, no. So
Yeah.
So
Martha Stewart.
So I agree with you.
I make a motion that we go over. 15
Yeah.
minutes to accommodate for the 4 or 5 minutes.
If I had authority to grant that motion, I would.
So granted. As people need to drop off, it's completely fine, but yeah, if you're able to, totally.
Sure.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I know people have, meetings and things, but
I would two-finger that. Actually, I might push back on Andrew and say that maybe all politicians have more information than we do, given
yeah.
like having worked in government, the number of cables that come through your desk that nobody else has access to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just to
Yeah, no, I.
support them.
Mhm.
Yeah, take your time and respond.
Well, I'm gonna ask more questions now.
So I agree that politicians might have more information, and I know that it's hard for us to actually measure to what extent that's the case and how that varies across shocks. But I guess what I was trying to say is that for that particular list of events, we could at least try to think of which of those events, even things that happened before that were kind of related, are more likely to be in the radar of politicians, and which ones are more likely to be really like a sudden surprise. And so in that sense, I think 9/11 of all those events is the one. So the investigation of the shocks that we have done, one of the items in that investigation was try to extract from the press coverage as much information as possible about how surprising that event was and how unexpected it was. This is not rocket science, but 9/11, of course, is one of those events that maybe not in its magnitude or violence, but could be in some way predicted because there had been in recent times episodes that make everybody think there might be a terrorist attack in the US coming from certain places. So it's reassuring in a way that the results continue to hold, even if we throw away that particular shock that seems to be the least surprising or sudden of all the ones in the list. But we can dig a bit more into perhaps more objectively measure which shocks were really unexpected and which ones are a bit more expected beyond 9/11, and do more robustness checks of that kind to see that the results continue to go through. Sorry, I think I didn't address your question. So you were asking that politicians who are, clients who are planning to do something bad, because they're planning to do something bad, they might be increase their lobbying before the shock. So and the second part of your reasoning was that, correct me if I'm wrong, once they have increased their lobbying before the shock, they have nothing else to lose from continuing to lobby. Did I understand?
No, it's nothing to lose. It would be to
Yeah, already.
reduce the shock to those they are lobbying. Reduce the magnitude of the harm, right? So that, first of all, the politicians could distance themselves a bit before the bad thing happens, right?
Okay.
And then come back with more support again afterwards by stressing whatever they're being lobbied about, or strategic
Okay.
importance of this relationship.
So that's
It's almost like the shock is a shock to the country too, the way it's modeled. But the
Yes,
shock is chosen. I mean, maybe the,
well, that's what causes the reputational harm to the
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in that case, you will be underestimating effect, no? Because it's like, this is boosting before
yeah.
reducing, so there's
Right.
going to be a lower bound of the real estate.
Yeah, and I was going to say exactly. So then you would expect not to see that much public distance change in public distancing after the shock, because maybe that has already occurred. We have the politician had time to strategically distance himself before the shock, but we do see that sharp change in the public sentiment after the shock.
But that seems like a really interesting opportunity. I don't know if it's an extension to think about different, like, if you were able to sort of take an extension, measure the extent to which it changed before the shock, you could characterize different shocks, right? In terms of like what could have been foreseen, and therefore whether that changes the dynamics or not.
We have Jamie, maybe that'll be the last question over here.
Yeah, I think I'm glad all these conversations have happened though, because have been wanting to ask about even the role of agents or mediaries between politicians and these foreign entities. For instance, we know that people often go through mediaries either to cover their tracks, or because the intermediary has a different, because of the strength in the mediary's reputation. That both countries that, their reputation might be diminished, they talk directly to each other, or the politician and the foreign entity, somehow they're able to preserve their reputation by going through a third party. Do you find that happening in?
So let me be clear about the nature of the context data. So the Pharah obliges every lobbying company that lobbies on behalf of foreign clients to register all the contacts with politicians on behalf of a foreign client every 6 months, right? So what we call contact between the politician and the foreign country is actually mediated, is a contact with the lobbyist of that foreign country. Most of those are exclusive kind of relationships. When we looked at the data, we saw that for most foreign clients, they are always represented by one lobbying company, and there are a few cases in which a lobbying company might serve two different foreign clients. But just to be clear, so we are measuring literally the meetings between those intermediaries that you mentioned and the foreign and the politician, because those are the meetings for which there is an obligation to report. And they have to be meetings on behalf of a particular foreign client, which has to be mentioned also in the Pharah file where the report is filed. So that allows us to attribute the contact to the client. Yeah.
Maybe I should have said neutral mediary. Yeah, I guess a lobbyist is an intermediate person, but we often don't think of them. We think of them as being the agent that represents this party.
So you were
maybe
not.
That's a clarification for your paper.
Okay.
What kind of lobbyists are you talking about? Because there's different kinds.
So I guess what you are asking is that maybe we think a bit about how characteristics of the lobbying company, which we can observe, we have some data on those, can moderate the relationship, incorporate that into the model, and then maybe develop some additional.
Well, let's go ahead and stop. I apologize, Giorgio, for the shock on the colloquium, but Giorgio will be here for the next couple of days. You can find him around and upstairs mostly, and so on. Anyway, thanks everybody. Thank you.
Mr.